Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today, we're going to be looking at the birth of Christendom, 500 to 850 AD. So grab a pen, a paper, a tablet, and a keyboard, and let's get going. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to describe how the collapse of the Roman Empire reshaped the Latin West, economically, politically, and socially, trace how Christian, Roman, and Germanic traditions survived, adapted, and began to blend into new cultural and political order, explain the Church's role in preserving knowledge, stabilizing society, and offering a new transnational identity. Evaluate how Charlemagne embodied the synthesis of Roman governance, Christian faith, and Germanic kingship. And finally, identify key continuities and adaptations from the Roman world that laid the foundation of medieval Christendom. In our last lecture, we mentioned that the late Roman period was a time of transition. We saw how the Roman world was transformed and how three civilizations emerged out of what had been one. In the East, the Roman Empire continued on as the Greek Christian Byzantine civilization. In the South, a new civilization emerged with Islam, reshaping the Mediterranean. And in the West, the empire fell, but its language, law, and faith persisted. Last lecture, we ended with the Frankish victory at Tours in 732. With Charlemagne on the horizon. In this lecture, we're going to focus on how the fragmented Latin West, once imperial but now fragmented and vulnerable, lacking central authority. Yet, from this wreckage, a new type of civilization would begin to emerge. What would become medieval Christendom, built not on one source, but on three powerful legacies. Like a rope, this new order would consist of three different strands. A Roman order, and it would be from Rome that law, bureaucracy, Latin literacy, and imperial ideas would be preserved. It would also have another strand, a Christian faith. This would provide the spiritual unity, the papal leadership, and moral worldview. And finally, a Germanic tradition. It would be warrior kings and their kin-based loyalty of personal bonds that would transform the political order that would begin to emerge. And these three strands would gradually coalesce into a new civilization we will be calling Latin Christendom. This will take several centuries, and the rest of this lecture will trace how these legacies endured, adapted, and began to fuse, and will culminate in Charlemagne, who didn't just rule a kingdom, but embodied this fusion. Okay. If we were to look around the Roman world in 500, 600 AD, we would see signs of urban decline everywhere. Roman cities would shrink or be abandoned. Civic infrastructure like aqueducts, baths, roads would all have deteriorated. Trade would have been disrupted. Long distance trade with the East and North Africa would have begun to falter, and the economy would have become more localized. Barter based and luxury goods would have been rare. Literacy would have been on the decline. Roman education would have largely disappeared outside of the church. And there would have been few elites. The classical tradition that had been the glory of Rome would have disappeared. And a new security crisis would have emerged. With no centralized army to guard its borders, communities would have been vulnerable. Banditry and tribal raids would have destabilized this region. Yet there were some survivals and adaptations. Rome still existed in certain forms. Titles like Duke and Count would have survived, and new leaders would take on these old Roman titles, although, as we'll see, in a different form. Roman law codes would have also continued to exist, and even some of the barbarian newcomers would want these written Roman laws, written in Latin, and they would use these to buttress their own tribal customs. Latin would still exist, albeit in a church context. And Rome's roads, built so well, would have been slow to deteriorate. Most of all, though, it would have been in the church that we would have seen the most continuity. The church would preserve Latin. It would preserve the Roman-style hierarchy that it itself had adopted. Bishops would have filled important civic voids as Roman leaders would have disappeared or been overwhelmed. And Roman-style administrative structures in general would have survived inside of the church. So Rome didn't entirely fall. It lived on in the memory, the habits, and in church institutions. One of the biggest changes that we would have noticed, were we to survey the situation in, say, 600 AD, is that life became much more rural. People abandoned cities as trade collapsed and as security declined. And life would reorient itself along and around large estates. With little trade, these estates would have been largely self-sufficient, and they would have produced and grown everything that they would have needed. The bureaucracy that had sustained Rome would have largely collapsed and been replaced by personal bonds. With no empire, there was no central enforcement mechanism. And rather, it would have been local strongmen living in these fortified locations that would have offered protection. It would have been the beginning of what we'll explore later as the lord-vassal relationship. Spoken Latin would have existed in some form, but it would have begun to shift into the Romance languages that we know today, like Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. And law would have become some form of fusion between Roman and tribal customs. One of the primary places that carried on the tradition of literacy would have been monasteries. Several lectures back, we talked about monasteries. This was a lifestyle that certain individuals would choose, and they would go in this, they would choose this lifestyle to get away from what they saw as the corruption of the church. One of the most famous monastic traditions was started by Benedict of Nursia, and this who lived in the 6th century for the most part. And this style, this rule, this way of life that Benedict outlined would have become pretty standard. The rule encouraged individuals to remain busy, and one of the ways monks would stay busy and avoid temptation was through scriptoria, or the preservation of classical and Christian texts. And so medieval monks would spend a good part of their day copying texts, mostly as an exercise, but it's thanks to this that a great deal of the classical and Christian tradition was preserved. And it would be these monasteries that would be the foundation of later intellectual developments. Bishops also emerged as key players in the wake of the collapse of the Roman Empire. Oftentimes it would be bishops who would act as regional leaders. Being generally educated, they could administer justice, they could collect rents, and were also critical in raising defenses. Bishops, of course, being churchmen, would continue to use Latin, especially in legal documents and in government, as well as in their church services. And so they were key players who would preserve Roman continuity. Bishops could be found in most major cities, or what was left of major cities, and they provided a type of cohesion in what was increasingly becoming a fragmented world. And they would help bind Latin Christendom together through a shared belief in structure, even as it politically disintegrated. Even though there was no longer an emperor in Rome, the popes, or the bishops of Rome, began to emerge as post-Roman leaders, filling the vacuum as moral and spiritual unifiers. The city of Rome, therefore, would still matter, but as a holy city, not so much as an imperial capital anymore. The church would offer structure, moral unity, and stability, even across tribal lines. So while what had been Rome was fragmenting, the church, led by the Pope, still brought this cohesion to the former empire. Certain popes, too, like Gregory the Great, were very pivotal. Gregory would have ruled in the late 500s and early 600s. And he was very pivotal in seeing the church through during the time of the barbarian invasions. Even more critical was his sending of missionaries out. This map here shows some of the missionary trips that were sent out. Now, Britain, or as we will soon call it, England, was one of the areas of the empire that had been really overwhelmed by barbarians. So much so that it was one of the areas of the empire where Latin was lost. So many barbarians came in, and it really became barbarized and also paganized. So it had been Christian, but as it was overwhelmed by barbarian tribes, it had become pagan again. And it was Gregory who was very influential in sending missionaries out to the tribes of the Angles and the Saxons who had settled there, also out to the Irish who had never been part of the empire, and even into Germany. And so it was through the actions of this that Gregory began to bring some of these regions back into the Christian fold. In a sense, he was kind of almost doing what Roman emperors had previously done on a political level, but now on a spiritual level. And so you can say that the popes almost acted as shadow emperors, stabilizing the empire spiritually and extending its borders, except this would have been the empire of Latin Christendom. And so through the actions of folks like Gregory the Great, the bishops, and monasteries that were spread all across what had been the Western Empire, a new type of identity began to emerge. Not so much Roman as perhaps Roman Catholic. And as Roman citizenship faded, a new type of citizenship based on baptism became the new marker of belonging across what was now a disparate region politically. The church was one of the few institutions that could offer a deeper identity beyond the tribal identity that many of the barbarians had brought with them. It offered a shared language, Latin, a common worldview of creation, of fall, and redemption, and a unified spiritual geography. Rome as a spiritual center along with Jerusalem and the cross and symbols like these. And so even though the empire was now divided into Visigoths and Franks and Anglo-Saxons, increasingly they all kneeled at one altar, and a new community began to emerge, bound by belief and not so much blood or law. It was the birth of what we could call Latin Christendom, a cultural and a spiritual network, and not so much a political one, capable of transcending tribe, region, and language. So hopefully we can see how Roman and Christian traditions contributed to this new world. What I want to do is turn to the third strand now. And those are the Germanic kingdoms and the Germanic peoples who had so recently entered what had been the empire. So after the fall of Rome, as we know from previous lectures, Germanic groups like Franks, Visigoths, and Anglo-Saxons established kingdoms on former Roman lands. These new states were still fundamentally tribal. Loyalty was to one's kin. Warriors and chieftains dominated society. And warrior culture of honor, strength, oath-taking, and gift-giving were all critical elements that these Germanic tribes brought with them. But tribal leaders found that it was beneficial to also adopt some Roman customs as well. Even after its fall, Rome remained a symbol of power, law, and legitimacy. Latin became the language of government, even in non-Latin regions. Kings adopted Roman titles. They issued Roman law codes and adopted Roman styles of legal custom. Christianity was also seen as a source of authority. Conversion to Christianity equaled legitimacy in the eyes of many of these barbarian tribal leaders' Christian subjects. In aligning themselves with the church often boosted their kingly power. Anointing by bishops gave kings spiritual prestige and allowed them to present themselves as sacred kings. Christianity also linked these new barbarian newcomers to the Roman imperial legacy and plugged them into a trans-tribal world that was starting to develop. Of these tribal kingdoms that were beginning to form, the Franks would become the most important. The Franks had begun as a relatively minor tribe in northeastern Gaul. But under their charismatic leader Clovis, who ruled from about 480 to about 410, this would change. Clovis would go on to conquer most of what would become known as France, named after the Franks. Clovis also converted to Latin or Roman Catholic Christianity, and this aligned him closely with the Pope, who was in Rome. And this strong alliance with the Church would continue later on. Clovis would go on to found what became known as the Merovingian dynasty. That's the descendants of Clovis. And this would lay the groundwork for an even more powerful Frankish dynasty, which would come later on, the Carolingians. Frankish kings would become champions of the church, and they would go on to patronize monasteries and become important papal allies. During this period, kingship was also evolving. Earlier kings were really little more than warlords. They were chosen primarily for their strength, their ability to win victory, and their ability to attract followers. Over time, though, a new model began to emerge, a new model of authority. Kings were increasingly looked upon as sacred rulers. That is, their prestige was based on the perception that they were the defenders of justice and God's order. Increasingly, they would be looked upon as Christian monarchs. Their rise to kingship would often involve being anointed with holy oil, and their legitimacy would be tied to church approval. And so this would really begin to elevate them from being just a warlord to a more holy and sanctified sort of leader. And this would obviously lend some legitimacy to them. And this would really lay the groundwork for medieval kingship, which was a fusion of political leadership, religious legitimacy, and a Roman imperial tradition that undergirded all of it. What I want to do now is turn to the Carolingians, who would become the most important family of this early medieval period. The Carolingians started off as powerful royal advisors to the Merovingians. That was that dynasty that Clovis had started. Last time we met Charles Martel, a member of this family, and Charles won an important victory in 732 at the Battle of Tours when he stopped Muslim expansion into northern Europe. From this point onward, Muslims would mostly be confined to Spain in Western Europe. This had brought Charles Martel, and the Carolingians for that matter, onto the church's radar, who began to see in this new family a potential ally. It was during these years that the popes were dealing with their own problems over in Italy with new barbarian tribes. Charles Martel's son, Pepin, his successor, felt strong enough to overthrow the Merovingians. For a while, the Carolingians had been the dominant family, serving under the weaker Merovingians, but by the 750s, Pepin felt strong enough to just depose them. The problem for Pepin, though, was he lacked legitimacy. He was essentially a usurper. And so he needed legitimacy. And so an important alliance was formed. The Pope needed protection, Pepin needed legitimacy, and so the Pope traveled north of the Alps to Francia, where he crowned Pepin as King of the Franks, anointing him with oil and giving him spiritual legitimacy for his kingship. And this would set a precedent. The church would shape rulership, and the rulers would rule on behalf of the church, or at least that was the ideal. The most important of the Carolingians, and probably the most important king of the entire Middle Ages, was Pepin's son, Charlemagne. Charlemagne would rule from 768 to 814. And it was under Charlemagne that the borders of Francia were expanded in multiple directions. And so in the north and in the east, Charlemagne would push the borders of Francia deep into Germania, conquering territories that Romans had never even conquered. He also pushed the borders south into Italy and fulfilled the Frankish promise to protect the popes, asserting their dominance over newly arrived barbarian tribes called the Lombards. He even pushed into Spain, securing a border territory against Muslim incursions. He pushed the borders even to the southeast, defeating groups like the Avars, Central Asian nomad tribes. And so Charlemagne really extended the borders of this empire, and even brought, other groups in, like the Slavs and groups like that, as kind of border vassal states. So you can see that this was really quite a large empire that Charlemagne forged. But Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror. He was also, though illiterate himself, he was interested in learning. By this point, after centuries and centuries of not having proper educational institutions, even among Europe's quote-unquote educated, literacy was at a pretty low level. And so Charlemagne sponsored a revival in learning. He brought in some of the most famous scholars of the early Middle Ages, people like Alcuin of York. They standardized Latin. They trained the clergy and further preserved some of the classical Latin texts. Monasteries, more than ever before, became important educational centers. Charlemagne even tried to get them to train the local populace, although to be fair, the funding wasn't really there for them to act as schools, but this was the vision anyways. Charlemagne was very keen on sponsoring church reforms, so that clerics would actually understand the Latin words that they were saying when they were doing a mass. He was very concerned that clerics were bumbling the mass. And so he increased their literacy, he improved their moral discipline. Many clerics had started to take wives and knew so little about Catholic tradition that they weren't really keeping it very well, and really improved the quality of the clergy. Now, there were some limits on this. This is sometimes called the Carolingian Renaissance, and so you're maybe thinking this is the Renaissance. Well, not exactly. That Renaissance would come about 600 years later. This was a Renaissance largely at the upper levels. So this was largely driven by Charlemagne himself, who was wealthy and powerful enough to sponsor a lot of these monasteries. It was very much elite focused. It was mostly the churchmen who were getting educated and pretty geographically limited to only certain locations and pretty fragile. This wasn't going to stick, and it wasn't going to start some brand new era of learning, but it was very important. It really brought levels back up and standardized and protected a lot of text that would have otherwise been lost. Symbolically, the most important event of Charlemagne's reign, though, was his crowning as emperor. Emperor of the Romans. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III, on Christmas Eve, crowned Charlemagne as the Roman emperor, reviving the imperial title. And in Leo's mind, in hope, restoring the Roman Empire. And so this was a very symbolic moment. By the way, this would later become known as the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't called that in Charlemagne's day, but this is to distinguish it from the Roman Empire. And this was the peak of this cultural synthesis we've been talking about. Here you had a essentially Germanic warrior king who was getting crowned Roman emperor by a Christian pope. So this was the full synthesis, the ultimate symbolism. He now ruled over this large entity, the biggest political entity that the West had seen since the collapse of the actual Roman Empire. And so this was a very symbolic moment. And so from his palace in Aachen, Charlemagne ruled this incredibly large territory. The Franks had inherited this fragmented Roman world full of ruined cities, disrupted trade, and tribal violence, with literacy on the decline. And churches had begun to fill the vacuums as bishops acted as civic leaders, monks had preserved learning, and the popes had provided the moral authority to start to forge a new unity. Charlemagne had united three worlds: the Roman order, the Christian faith, and Germanic customs, as he was crowned Emperor of the Romans. But this was to be a brief unity. The renewed learning, the church reforms, and the medieval imperial vision wouldn't last. The empire lacked stable institutions. It relied primarily on the vigor of Charlemagne himself, and it would soon fragment after his death. Even in Charlemagne's own day, there were signs, ominous signs, literally on the horizon. Charlemagne witnessed with his own eyes Viking longships just off the coast of Francia. There were persistent frontier threats as well. Central Asian nomads, Slavic unrest, and even some of the tribes that Charlemagne had subdued, like the Saxons in northern Germany, proved to be intractable. This was an empire that required the strong leadership of someone like Charlemagne. But unfortunately, future Frankish rulers would be unable to hold it together. In just 2 generations after Charlemagne, his heirs would divide the empire in 3. Known as the Treaty of Verdun in 843, Francia would be split into 3. Fragmentation would return, and this would come at a time when Western Europe would face its greatest threats, and a new round of disorder would begin to descend. And so it's next time that we'll look at this disorder, the feudalism, the localization, and the attempts at imperial renewal once again. And so join me next time as we look at feudalism.